afternoon, everyone. I hope you have a pleasant Thursday today. This is the last talk of HBL seminar for November. Okay, and I'm very pleased to present our invited speaker today, Seong-won Han, soon to be doctor. 7 years ago, Seong-won received her bachelor's degree in physical education from Yonsei University in South Korea, specializing in pedagogy. She then went on to do a master's degree in physical education at the same university, but this time she crossed over to the field of biomechanics, studying the asynchronous alterations of muscle strength and tendon stiffness following 12 weeks of training in elderly people. Now, her supervisor during the master program was Dr. Hae-dong Lee, who many of you knows him because he was in HBL several years ago. Now, in 2015, Seong-won decided to follow the footsteps of Dr. Lee and came to the University of Calgary to start a PhD program with Dr. Walter Herzl. For her PhD research, she is interested in the mechanics of patellofemoral joint in the presence of imbalance in quadriceps muscle. She has presented some of the results of this study in the HBL seminar before. This work also drew international attention when she was selected as the finalist of the prestigious Young Investigator Award in the ISB Brisbane 2 years ago. In addition to her main project, Seong-won also developed an interest in cardiac muscle, particularly in the mechanics of at the subcellular level, the myofibrils. Seong-won plans to defend her PhD in next summer, and she hopes to land a postdoc position in the research area of myofibrillar mechanics after that. Some fun fact about Seong-won: like a lot of the speakers, Seong-won also likes the Rocky Mountains, but she does not enjoy hiking. Instead, prefer to be chairlifted to the top of the mountains so that she can have fun in downhill skiing. Now, recently, Seong-won is into detective stories. She bought a 10-book series of Sherlock Holmes, and she can't wait to get back to them after the HBL seminar. Now, I think we have enough, we know enough of Seong-won's background now. I will pass the mic to her for her talk, Residual Force Enhancement in Cardiac Myofibrils, please.
Thanks for the introduction. So, before I start introducing about my research I did previously, I would like to briefly explain about muscle and its force. This figure shows skeletal muscles hierarchy. A whole muscle is formed of fiber bundles or fascicles, which are composed of muscle fibers right here. And these muscle fibers consist of bundles of myofibril, which is visible under the light microscope. It's shown as here, and it has distinct striation pattern. And this repeated units in a series is called a sarcomere, which is the basic contractile unit in muscle. And I brought a schematic image of sarcomere. The sarcomere is bordered by the two Z line, which I colored red. It also consists of thin structure or thin filaments or actin filaments, and also has myosin filaments containing projections, which are called myosin heads right here, shown as short bars. The sarcomere produces force through the interaction between actin and myosin filaments at the overlapped area where I colored yellow. And this interaction allows the actin filaments slide towards to the center of the sarcomere, causing the sarcomere shorten, thereby producing force along the myofibril. And this action is regarded as cross-bridge theory. Overall force is dictated by the number of cross bridges that are able to form. And since the length of sarcomere determines the overlapped amount of the overlap right here, force output over one sarcomere is largely dictated by its length. This graph shows a modified active force length relationship from the classic study done in 1966. On the y-axis right here, force level is shown in a percentage as a function of sarcomere length. It has two phases of ascending limb and plateau region on the top and descending limb on the right side of the graph. What this graph tells us is that the amount of maximum isometric active muscle force is dependent of sarcomere length, as I mentioned previously. Here, I'll show you a schematic image of sarcomere, which we saw in the previous slide, but now it is at its longest length. In this length, there is no overlapped area between actin and myosin here, and therefore the maximum isometric force that could generate from this length should be 0, shown as red dots on the curve. However, as the sarcomere length gets shorter, and therefore more cross bridges are able to form, the maximum isometric force increases. When the number of cross bridges is at its maximum, the force reaches to its 100%, shown in here. Since there is a bare region right here in the middle of the myosin filament where there is no cross bridges at all, as the actin filaments go through that bare region, since there is no further cross bridges that could be formed, force remains constant right here. When the sarcomere shortens more from here, now the force starts decreasing due to the smaller number of cross bridges interrupted by part of actin filament right here. Finally, from this point where the sarcomere length is same as entire myosin length plus Z line, when the muscle length becomes shorter, myosin filaments get somehow deformed due to the external structure. So the force starts decreasing more, and eventually the force drops till 0 when there is no cross bridges at all. This relationship has been established for over half a century and traditionally used in a textbook and research. But what I am presenting today is one of the aspects that cannot be explained by this classic theory, and it is called residual force enhancement, and I will call it in short force enhancement. Then what is force enhancement? Based on the force length relationship that we have seen so far, the level of maximum isometric force is governed by the sarcomere length. Let's have an example of sarcomere. So we have exemplar schematic sarcomere, which I colored red, and let's say the length of this sarcomere is 3.0 micron. Based on a force length curve, since the length of the sarcomere is 3.0 micron, when we activate this sarcomere without any length change isometrically, what we'll see is slightly greater than 60% of muscle force of its maximum. Now let's have another example of sarcomere, which I colored green, and the length of the sarcomere is shorter than 3 micron. Now what we are gonna do is activate this shorter micron right now, and then stretch this muscle during muscle activation till the length reaches to 3 micron, same as above the one. Since based on the force length relationship, since both sarcomere lengths are exactly the same, therefore the amount of the overlap between actin and myosin is the same. Therefore, the number of cross bridges should be the same, which means that the force of the green sarcomere has to be exactly the same place where the previous sarcomere showed. However, it is found that the force for the green sarcomere, or the sarcomere that was actively stretched, was actually greater than this reference force, and that this two force discrepancy is called force enhancement. Then how do we measure this force enhancement during testing? This trace shows the exemplar force enhancement trace. So on the y-axis, there are force and muscle length as a function of time. And this yellow bar here is the time point when we activate the muscle. First, we measure the reference force while there is no length change here. So I would call this as a reference force. Now what we are going to do is to measure the muscle force after active stretching. So we start with the muscle shorter than this, the reference length, and then activate it. Once the force reaches to steady state, we actively stretch the muscle here and then wait for a few seconds till the force becomes stable. And the two forces that I extrapolate, this discrepancy is defined as force enhancement experimentally. Force enhancement is systematically found in all structural skeletal muscle. However, its mechanism is still uncertain. And as I mentioned earlier, this phenomenon cannot be explained by the classic cross-bridge theory. So many people have investigated its mechanism in various ways. One interesting finding was that when we deactivate the muscle where we measure the reference force drops, giving us its passive force. But when we deactivate the muscle that was actively stretched, which was green, solid line, we still see force is greater than the reference passive force. Based on this observation, that we still see force discrepancy, although all active component is completely gone, people thought that maybe then passive components would contribute to this force enhancement. And the question is, what passive structure in the muscle? So since there are multiple structures in muscle, so people investigated force enhancement all different structural skeletal muscle to see what passive structure could be included. First, human in vivo and like multi-joints and whole muscle level force enhancement was observed, where the entire passive structure, including membranes surrounding all muscle structures and all the connective tissues inside of it. Force enhancement was also found when the bundle of muscle fiber was used. And at this level, there is no passive structure such as fascia or epimyoseum surrounding the whole muscle, but we still saw force enhancement. Going down to muscle fiber, we still saw force enhancement when most of passive structure were gone, except for sarcolemma. And at last, myofibril and even in a single sarcomere showed force enhancement when it was tested. Considering the fact that there is nothing left in passive structure, so we need to think what is the last primary passive structure remaining in this level. In the literature, the passive structure remaining in the myofibril and sarcomere primarily generating passive force is known as Titin. It has been proposed that Titin may be a major contributor to force enhancement. Let me explain about this suggestion mechanism further. Now we are looking at half sarcomere schematic image. So this is Z line and actin filament, and half of myosin filaments, and this is M band. Titin, shown as green structure, spans the half sarcomere connecting Z line and actin area, or I band or A band in myosin. But today I am only focusing on the Titin filaments, part of Titin filaments that are existing in the I band only, because it is extendable and also thought to be part of or contributor of force enhancement. Based on the suggestion mechanism, it is known that during muscle activation, titin somehow interacts with actin filament. Therefore, now we have shorter free length of titin right here. And only this part is able to stretch, while this interacting part of titin is not able to stretch. So during muscle activation, part of titin attached to actin filament having shorter free length of titin that could be stretched. When we stretch muscle during activation, this shortened part is only responsible for the stretching, giving us greater passive force and also stiffer property. And this greater passive force is assumed to be the reason why we are observing increased force after after the muscle is actively stretched. So then this mechanism is only addressed using skeletal muscle previously. Then the one of following question could be then, if we use different types of titin compared to skeletal muscle, then would we still see force enhancement using different types of titin? But in order to answer this question, we want to know where we can get the different types of titin compared to skeletal titin. In the literature, it was found that cardiac titin is much shorter and stiffer than the skeletal titin. Here I brought the force-length relationship once more. So when we stretch skeletal muscle or skeletal myofibril passively, then the passive force looks like this. However, if we do the same testing but using cardiac muscle, then what we'll see here is this red trace. So as you can see, the passive force starts very shorter length of sarcomere compared to skeletal muscle. And as the slope says, cardiac titin is much stiffer than skeletal muscle. In addition to this, it has been observed that cardiac titin has different titin isoforms compared to skeletal titin. This image tells us the structural properties of skeletal titin. I'm not explaining the specific region here, but what was found is that skeletal titin has only one structural properties, whereas cardiac titin we have here. It was found that cardiac titin has two distinctively different isoforms compared to skeletal muscle. So what we can summarize from this slide and the previous slide is that cardiac titin is structurally different from skeletal titin. Then going back to the question that we wanted to determine before, if we test force enhancement using cardiac titin, then would we still see force enhancement? So I searched this research question and I found 4 studies done. These are all current studies addressing force enhancement using cardiac muscle. And as you see that this research is pretty newer research area. When I was reading these papers, I found their results seems to be interesting. 2 of studies done in 2015 and 19, both et al., they said, yes, there is force enhancement in cardiac muscle. However, the other 2 studies done in 2016 and 17, they said, nope, there is no force enhancement in cardiac muscle. So I wanted to know which one is actually true, and also wanted to reconcile these contradicting results. Therefore, the purpose of this study is to see if force enhancement exists in cardiac myofibrils. And we hypothesized that cardiac myofibrils exhibit force enhancement. In this study, we used New Zealand white rabbits, and heart was harvested from this species. Once the harvesting is done, heart was dissected to get the left ventricle of the heart, which is shown in here, and it was cut into small pieces and stored in the freezer for 3 weeks. After all scanning procedures, we homogenized this small sample to get a single myofibril, which is shown in here. So you can see that the striation pattern, so that's the cardiac myofibril mounted in our testing. Its left end is fixed to the glass needle where we can adjust its length. And the right end of myofibril is fixed to the cantilever, left side of cantilever right here. In order to measure muscle force, we first measure the distance between the reference cantilever, which is the right side here, and we calculate this distance. And then, during muscle activation, once calcium is released, myofibril here is shortening, pulling the cantilever toward the needle, glass needle. So once the force reaches to steady state, we measure this displacement again due to the muscle contraction, and then compare this displacement. Also knowing the using stiffness of the cantilever, we can calculate the muscle force. The length range that we tested in this study, first we measure the reference force at 1.8 micron, shown as a red dot on the curve. And then we also measure the force that the myofibril was actively stretched from 1.6 to 1.8 to see if indeed the force after active stretching is greater than the reference force. We repeated this testing at different length range, where the final or the reference length were 2.0 and 2.2 microns, and the increment of stretching was the same as 0.2 micron. So we do have different, like 3 different length range tested. As the main outcome of this study, we calculate force enhancement by using the two forces discrepancy normalized by the reference force and times 100 in order to get the magnitude of force enhancement in percentage. This graph shows the exemplar trace that we saw in one of our myofibrils during testing. Upper graph shows stress with the nanonewton per micron squared, and the lower trace shows how we changed the length. And in this example, the reference length was 2.0 micron, stretching it from 1.8 micron as a function of time. First, we measured the reference force at 2 micron and leaving this force as a reference force. Once the force reaches to steady state, we quickly shorten it to 1.8 micron and wait for a while till the muscle force fully recovered. And then we slowly stretched this muscle again back to reference length here, again 2.0 micron, to induce force, to see if there is force enhancement after stretching, even though they are compared at the same length of muscle. And in this myofibril, yes, we saw force enhancement, and these two forces discrepancy, we define it as force enhancement here. Now let's see our main result. Using this calculation, our main results is plotted on the graph, where the magnitude of force enhancement is shown in percentage as a function of reference length we tested. So we found force enhancement in cardiac muscle. Specifically, each opened circles means single data point that was observed from one myofibril at each reference length. And the red solid bar at each reference length means the average value of the data points. So in summary, we test cardiac myofibril, and all myofibrils we tested showed force enhancement. And the average value of force enhancement ranged from 13 to 20%. Now let's compare our results to the previous studies. Earlier, I have mentioned that there were 4 studies only, and 2 studies are contradicting each other to the other studies. So let me compare our results to these two studies first. Here I brought a summary table that will be shown soon. Let me start with the first study, Bolt et al., done in 2015. They used left ventricle of the heart, and the testing was done at the myofibrillar level, which is exactly the same preparation as we did. They measured the reference force at the 3.2 micron, and to see force enhancement, they stretched from 2.4 to 3.2 microns. And then they found 54% of force enhancement, which is much bigger than what we found, 13 to 20%. So I wonder why we got smaller magnitude of force enhancement. In the previous studies, it was found that the magnitude of force enhancement depends on the region on the force length curve. So they found a greater magnitude of force enhancement on descending limb compared to the ascending limb. In our study, we tested force enhancement on ascending limb, which colored red, but Bolt et al., they did on the descending limb. Also, it is known that the amount of stretching affects the amount of the force enhancement. So greater amount of force enhancement was found when the muscle was stretched more. Considering the fact that we only stretched muscle 0.2 micron compared to the 0.8 micron that they did, I think this also explains why we saw a lower level of force enhancement compared to the previous study. Now let's move on to the next study done in this year. They used trabeculae, which is different part of heart muscle, and this testing was done using fiber bundles. And they found only 5% of force enhancement. Since they used different part of heart muscle and the testing was done at different level, while we used myofibril but they used muscle fiber, it is a bit hard to make a direct comparison to our research. However, it is normally found that when we test the same thing on the myofibrillar level, we found a greater amount of force enhancement compared to the other one. Now, let's go to the two studies that did not show force enhancement. They used left ventricle and popular muscle, and the testing was done on the myofibrillar level. The length range that they test seems to be similar to us, but they still didn't find any force enhancement at all. And the main reason why they did not find force enhancement is, I believe, because of the stretching velocity that they chose. And I believe that was too fast in the previous studies. Let me explain about this further. This is the figure from the Fukutani et al. 2019. On the y-axis, force is shown as a function of time. And this graph shows the normal amount of force enhancement using soleus muscle. The stretching velocity was 2 seconds, which is slow, and they found the normal amount of force enhancement here. It is usually known that the velocity of stretching does not affect the magnitude of force enhancement, but that's when only the velocity is limited into slow to the moderate. But if we stretch the muscle really fast, let's see what happened here. This red trace is reference force, and the blue trace is quick stretching and showing no force enhancement at all at the end. The reason why they didn't find the force enhancement in this fast stretching is assumed to be because of the slippage, where muscle loses all previous history, whatever happened before. So the main characteristic of slippage that can be found in the force trace is that after a quick stretch, force goes lower than the reference force and then slowly recover here to the reference force. So the they found like the same level of force because the given length was the same. So that's the reason why I think that fast velocity would affect the amount of force enhancement. Now let me show you the force trace that was found in one of the studies. Now the color has been changed. The black trace shows the reference force, and the red trace shows quick stretching and then no force enhancement at the end. To me, the red trace after quick stretching and then going to the lower level of force compared to the reference force, and then slowly recover to the reference force, this image seems to be very similar to the blue trace in the left image, assuming that force enhancement may not have been found due to this slippage or due to the fast stretching inducing slippage. So I think this likely explains why force enhancement was not observed in the two studies. Now, let's relate our results to the suggested mechanism in force enhancement related to Titin. Earlier, I've mentioned that Titin is believed to contribute to force enhancement by interacting with the actin filament during muscle activation. And I also explained that this mechanism was addressed only using skeletal muscle. Let me explain further detail about this. So here I separated Titin from the schematic image. One of the questions regarding the interaction with actin filament is that which part of Titin would interact with actin filaments during muscle activation. Let's see the Titin structure in skeletal muscle again. As you see, there are multiple different regions is aligned along the structure. Out of these multiple regions, some people were interested in this N2A region specifically, and hypothesizing that this N2A region would interact with this actin filament during muscle activation. So what they did was to try to eliminate this area and then test force enhancement, expecting to see much lower level of or no force enhancement at all. However, there is no clear result so far. Some muscle fiber shows lower level of force enhancement, but the other muscle fiber did not show decrease of amount of force enhancement. Then let's see the cardiac Titin structure here again. As I briefly explained earlier, cardiac Titin is distinctively different structure compared to skeletal muscle. While skeletal Titin has only one type of isoform, cardiac Titin exhibits co-expressions of N2B and N2BA. If I summarize this information with our results, what I can say for now is that although the structure of cardiac Titin is distinctively different from the skeletal muscle, we still saw force enhancement in cardiac muscle. Of course, we still cannot answer about which part of Titin would interact with actin filament, but what we could speculate based on our result is that binding to actin filament or the interaction with the actin filament in Titin could occur vastly different of a region that can be found in both cardiac and skeletal muscle Titin. In summary, we found force enhancement in cardiac myofibril in this study. Our results suggested that force enhancement is a common phenomenon that can be found in both skeletal and cardiac myofibrils. Thank you for your attention.
About this velocity of stretching, I was wondering if you're stretching very fast, you're basically some of the force, some of the force changes to the acceleration, and that's the reason why we don't see the residual force enhancement? Or
Sorry, I didn't get your question. So you're mentioning about the fast stretching velocities.
Yeah, when you're stretching very fast, so the material is basically accelerating, right?
Right.
So if you consider the Newton's law as equals ma, so that acceleration is basically some of the force, that now is being reduced because of that acceleration.
So I don't know how exactly acceleration would relate it to the stretching velocity, but wouldn't that acceleration could occur in slower speed as well?
Was the velocity constant when you were
Yes.
accelerating?
Yeah. It's not getting faster as I stretching them. So the velocity itself is the same. There's no increase of the velocity. I think that's the definition of acceleration, isn't it? So I would say, no, there's
So
no...
What was the reason for that reduction in force?
What is the reason
What
for?
was the reason for that reduction in force?
As I mentioned, it is assumed to be because of the slippage where the muscle or sarcomere loses all the history. So to me, how I understood is that due to the fast stretching, cross bridge is somehow detached from where it was used to be. And then slowly, the cross bridge is slowly recovered. That's how I understood. And then since it lost its history, when we act, it goes back to its reference force, where it's exactly the same thing, because the given length is the same. So that's how I assumed.
Can I just make a quick comment to that? I mean, you're right. I mean, because you always start at a zero velocity and then you stop at a zero velocity. And so the velocity cannot be constant during stretch, but you have to ramp up to get there, and then you have to slow down. And so when you do that very fast, then of course the acceleration would be higher in a
Some
quick
of that
stretch.
acceleration does it change to force, or how does it? What I think about, I'm thinking about the ductile material when you're doing the stretching test, and when it goes to a yield point, the material is somehow yields, and then the force actually goes down because some of that force changes to the acceleration. At least that happens in the ductile material, but not for long.
I would assume the mechanism of slippage where you lose force is different in muscle than related to the acceleration. And usually in muscle mechanics, you don't really count the acceleration because the force in a muscle is incredibly high relative to the mass. And so usually inertial effects are neglected in muscle. I'm not sure if that's good or bad and justified or not, but the way it's usually justified is that the muscle mass is very, very small compared to the forces that we're dealing with.
I think you might have actually already answered my question, but what I was curious about is that when you first showed the plots of residual force enhancement, you stress the muscle, force goes up, and then after the stretch, it comes down and sort of comes down to the residual level. And then you showed another one, which was, I think, the faster case, where the force went up really quickly, and then it went down,
Right.
and then it slowly came up
Again.
to the residual force. And my question is, why is one going from high to low and the other going from low to high? And then what you just said was talking about slippage. So maybe I'll change my question. Is that the explanation for why one goes high to low and one goes low to high? Is because in one there's the slippage?
Is it the reason why?
I'm asking you, well, maybe we can just go back to the graph. Yeah, so on the left,
Right.
force goes higher and then comes back down to a plateau.
Mm-hmm.
And on the right, force goes high and then low, and then it rises to the plateau.
Right.
The question is, why is one coming down and one coming up.
So the reason why the force drops after this stretching here is, to me, it is like a stretch relaxation curve. So after the stretching is complete, the force gets stable. So this is why the force going down. Is that what you're asking about this figure?
That's not what I was asking, but actually while you mentioned that, so what do you mean by relaxation? So what's the mechanism of that coming down?
I think it's material property. Like after stretching, the force is changing over time during stretching, and then the force drops because of its material property.
Oh, okay.
So maybe to just answer that, if you just remove the basic 1957 Huxley cross-bridge theory and you look at the mathematics, what happens is when you stretch muscles, the elastic element that connects the cross-bridge to the myosin filament elongates, and so therefore the force in a given cross-bridge will be higher. So when you stretch a muscle, the reason why you get more force according to cross-bridge theories is because that so-called Huxley X distance becomes bigger and the force per cross-bridge increases. And then when you stop, then you have regular turnover of cross-bridges and they attach at normal sites, and then the cross-bridge distance becomes smaller. So you lose force per cross-bridge in an isometric contraction compared to stretch. So that's the mathematical cross-bridge explanation.
Okay, I think that's what I was sort of assuming, is that reduction has really come from cross-bridge cycling, where you have a cross-bridge that's been elongated and then it cycles, and then when it attaches again, it's not going to be in the same location, it's going to be attached somewhere nearby. So then the question is, if you believe in that explanation, then why would the one on the right have that rising force?
Like a rising force right here?
Yeah.
I think that's part of the one that I already answered, like a cross bridge already detached due to the really quick stretching, and then located somewhere, and then attached again very close to this place. So that's how I see this slow recovery of the force.
Okay, and then I guess I would like for the time constant to be similar between those two, because both of them are mediated by cross-bridge cycling, and so maybe people already know this. So the time constant of that coming down, basically a similar time constant to the rise.
It might be possible, I think, but I haven't quantified the two different velocity.
What is the functional relevance of the residual force enhancement when most of our muscle contractions are much faster than 2 seconds?
First of all, so I think the question covers both skeletal and cardiac muscle, right? Because it is functional. I would say there's no directly related functional application, like compared to like force enhancement versus the functional. But this is more like about basic mechanism research. So I don't know how it could be directly related to functional application for both skeletal and cardiac muscle.
I think one of the things also is, people have typically measured the residual force enhancement at steady state. But we and other people have shown that it actually accumulates during the stretch, so it's not something that happens after the stretch. So if you take that stretch there on the left side, and you make that stretch longer, then you will get more force enhancement, but your peak force at the end of the stretch will be higher as well. And then you stretch more, and then the peak force gets even higher. So you take advantage of that enhancement during the stretch, and right away, it's there right away. So you don't have to wait 3 or 4 seconds. That's just a convenient way of measuring it.
Well, I got a question from South. Marco said, Why is there a decrease in the RFE when going from 1.8 to 2.2 micrometers? Shouldn't be
Okay,
it go up while going from short to a long length?
so I think that's from the main result graph. And asking about why the magnitude of force enhancement is going down. First of all, there is no statistical changes at all, so I can't say the magnitude of force enhancement was decreasing as the length of sarcomere gets longer. But so yeah, that's my first answer. And another thing is why we saw force enhancement getting kind of lower is because how we normalize this force enhancement. Since I am on the ascending limb, as the sarcomere length gets longer, the reference force is actually getting higher. So if I measure the force enhancement at the longer length and then normalized by the reference force measured in 2.2 micron, I am actually using bigger reference force compared to the shorter microns. So the question is then, if I compare the absolute value of force enhancement, then do I see the inverse relationship? And yes, if I compared the force enhancement in the absolute value, then I kind of see increasing force enhancement.
So the answer isn't Titin more stretch when you go longer?
Is it Titin stretched more at the longer length? Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
You want to show whether or not there is
Yes.
force enhancement. And then I think you are also interested in why or how it develops. I don't think that you answered that second question, did you?
Like how the force enhancement was developed in cardiac muscle?
Yeah.
I don't think I addressed that point at all in my talk. But I think in terms of how it was developed, I have actually no clear answer, but I do believe that cardiac titin is also maybe contributing to force enhancement.
I mean, if you take the model that you have with the Titin spring first parallel and then down,
Right.
how can you use that to explain what happens?
Right. So let me go back to that figure and then explain how it is developed.
Yeah.
So you mean using in the cardiac muscle as well? So that mechanism was only addressed using skeletal muscle.
Now, has anybody seen that, or
No,
is
this is
that
just
an assumption?
assumption, one of suggestion mechanism.
Okay, so let's assume that this is how it is
Mm-hmm.
in reality. How can you then use that to explain, if you do that and the rate changes like that and whatever, then you have to have more force, therefore you have force enhancement.
Sorry, I think I didn't clearly understand what your question, but if I explain what I understood so far. So you mean how this shortened part of Titin would contribute to force enhancement? Is that what you're asking? So based on the suggestion mechanism, of course, during muscle activation, this part where it is assumed to be interactive with actin filament is not extendable at all. So that's a fixed area, but still this area is extendable when the sarcomere is stretched. So during muscle activation, part of Titin already sticks to actin filament, and now we still only have this shortened part compared to prior to the muscle activation. So if we stretch the muscle during activation, the stretching should be happening only through this shortened part. Now this part has to be stretched more to reach the same length that the where the reference force was measured. So if the shortened part is stretched more, then I would expect to see greater passive force and stiffer structure as well. And this,
Now, the fact that you drew the green part with a different waveform, does that mean that it is a different thickness?
um,
If this looks like this, it's less thick than what it was before.
what I wanted to, so that's just a schematic image and it doesn't explain any properties of Titin, but what I wanted to make a point is it stretches more than before. Because we have shortened
the
the
same
part.
stiffness, but more elongation.
Same stiffness, more elongation.
But that gives you the explanation why.
Yes,
Okay.
and then, but the part is shortened and then needs to be stretched more. So that's how I explained, I think.
As a matter of fact, may I make a comment?
Yeah.
It's a beautiful presentation.
Thank you.
Can I make another comment?
Yeah.
Because the reason then, it was a very good question, that there is essentially just one group. The one group has argued that this particular region that Seong-won pointed out is important for the attachment there. This is so-called end-to-A segment. And so in some Titin isoforms in cardiac muscle, end-to segment is not there. So the idea is if you get a myofibril that has the end-to-A segment, then you would see that particular behavior. But if you get one that doesn't have it, then you wouldn't see it. And so the idea then was, would we potentially see the force enhancement in some, but not in others? And then could we then verify that the ones where we saw that has the end-to-A segment and where we didn't see wouldn't have the end-to-A segment? Where since she seems to see every single myofibril, that doesn't seem to be a possibility.
What was the absolute value of the force that increased, or the residual force that you had?
Like how much it was increased, or?
Yes, instead of in percentages.
So that depends on the length range I tested. And I actually normalized the force into stress using the cross-sectional area. So in my head, I have only stress value now. The reference stress usually 50 nanonewton per micron squared. And it was like a 20% increase. So you can calculate the, so 50% is 20%.
Okay.
10, yep. Then 60 stress, and then the cross-sectional area of cardiac muscle was 1.3 or 4 micron squared. So that will give you force value.
So did you get a nonlinear increase, or did you get a linear increase
Oh.
in your force at different lengths?
At different lengths. So you mean the isometric force at different lengths?
So the offset that you got at one length, was that offset the same at each length in terms of force, or was it a nonlinear increase?
I didn't understand what you mean by the offset of the.
So the residual force that you got at each length, when you go up the curve,
Yep.
is that a linear increase, or is that a nonlinear
No,
increase?
this is not a linear increase at all.
Okay, so then that would support this hypothesis as well. Because as you attach greater onto the actin, you're going to have a nonlinear spring stiffness difference. So as you increase, you're going to have a different spring stiffness,
Right.
right? And so then that's going to cause greater force as you lengthen at longer lengths.
Right.
Arash, I was just wondering, I asked this question a long time ago, but I just forgot the answer. Why do you normalize to stress? Why don't you use just the force? You in your graphs you recorded the stress Newton per millimeter square. Why
Why do I normalize?
Yeah, why do you just So why?
Because the myofibril size is always different. So the force has to be different when the myofibril size is different. So bigger myofibril would have bigger force. But I wanted to normalize it by stress so that the size of myofibril does not affect to our results.
Could you show the slide from Fukutani,
Yep.
please? Now you showed that example. There's another one here. That there's no difference in the force at the top there, but at the bottom there is a difference. As a matter of fact, you have another slide where that is even more the case,
Sorry.
where you don't have a difference in the nominal force or the measured force, so the residual force is 0. How about at the bottom?
He wants to see the
Oh.
Kronapurni slide.
Yeah,
This one.
this one, yeah. You know, you have no difference at the there, but
Right.
difference there.
Difference here.
Why do you have a difference there?
That's one of my main questions about this paper, and I couldn't find any context that they were addressing about the passive force enhancement that you found here as well. But the assumption that I have that the reason why they would find passive force enhancement here is possibly damage of the myofibril, because what they did is they did multiple activation in one single myofibril, and myofibril is usually very fragile, so after a couple of activation it might be a little bit damaged, losing the most level of force. So that's my assumption regarding this increased passive force. Another assumption actually I have is that maybe if they stretched slowly here, then the force would be a little bit higher along this increase, and then showing total force enhancement in addition to passive force enhancement as well. But that's still, I have no idea as well still.
I wrote a little letter to the editor about this paper because they show also other traces, and they seem to have multiple activations, and when you calculate what the sarcomere length is and what theoretically the force should be, then that initial rate of force there should be higher, and they show other traces where it actually should be much higher. So it seems that in some of these traces they almost lost 50% of the force from the first activation to the second one, and that would reflect itself in the active force. And the active force enhancement, but not necessarily in passive. So my argument was what probably happened is the multiple activations, and not accounting for the fact that they were losing reference force, not accounting for that properly. I think they actually would have, or that was actually the argument in the letter of the editor, they actually would have residual force enhancement as well, not only passive force enhancement. But they didn't account for the fact that they lost as much as 50% of the force from one activation to the other.
Oh, the question from Marco, the question is, what is the role of cardiac muscle force enhancement during heart function?
So the question is, how does results relate to the heart functioning? My answer is actually I don't know, because there is no, well, there is known to be eccentric phase of heart when the heart is working, but this is when I measure the force enhancement when force is steady state, so stretching, and then after we wait for a while. So, and there is no this phase in the heart muscle. So in terms of heart functioning related to force enhancement, I don't know, and I don't think there is any applicable idea in terms of it. But one of comments that I got regarding heart functioning and mechanical testing in a European muscle conference, Maybe force depression, which is different aspect compared to the force enhancement, would be somehow related to heart functioning. But that's still, I need to figure it out more.
But just a quick comment, in Chem or at the Muscle Symposium, when we discussed exactly this issue, to my big surprise, actually, Henry Bronzier, who knows more about cardiac muscle than I do, but he was saying that there is actually a small eccentric phase even in the heart at the very, very end of filling. So he felt, if you remember,
Yep.
When we discussed that there actually is an eccentric phase.
Yeah, I mean, I'm aware that eccentric phase exists during the heart blood filling, but I guess the question was how the residual force enhancement was related to the functioning.
Or
So,
just
yeah.
because you said there was no active stretch
Yeah.
there in cardiac muscle, and Hank Bronzy was saying
Yeah.
exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
He was saying there was a little bit
Yeah.
at the very end. So then, of course, if that was the case and there was residual force enhancement, then of course, then you increase the force, so that would be great.
Yeah.
So then it immediately would be functionally relevant.
Yep.
If that's correct, which I don't know because I'm not a cardiac physiologist.
I got a question from Kevin. So in your experiments, you do a shortening and then a relengthening. Do you account for force depression during that initial shortening?
Yes, I think he's asking about, so let me quickly go back to the force trace that So I think his question is related to this quick shortening, going back to the short initial length and then stretch back. So his question is if the force depression would be happening when I quickly shorten here. And my answer is it might be, but I don't think the result will be changed because force depression is affected by the shortening velocity, which here it was really fast. And faster shortening velocity will have lower level of magnitude of force depression. And also we waited over 30 seconds here till the force is getting recovered enough. So I would say yes, there is depression effect, but I don't think it will affect our result.
And just to emphasize that, I mean, that's exactly why we did a quick shortening. And in other experiments, we have shown when you wait approximately 1 second, even after a slow shortening, any effect for force depression in the following force enhancement is gone. And so we waited very, very long. So it's fairly safe to assume there is no remnant force depression there because of that.
So, Seong-won, it's the mechanism behind residual force enhancement. You brought up the actin binding to Titin to show it in the spring. But there is another mechanism that goes back in history, back to the Morgan paper. When we talk about non-uniformities,
Right.
Force enhancement. Did you analyze your specimens for non-uniformities in sarcomer length across the specimen to see if you could explain in the cardiac, which has a very high massive stiffness, that your residual force enhancement could be derived from non-uniformities?
I didn't measure how the single sarcomere length, so I don't know, but I know there is a variation of the non-uniformity of the sarcomere in a myofibril, but no, I haven't measured the length of sarcomere, so I don't know about that answer. And also, my testing was done on ascending limb, so I don't know how I could relate our results to sarcomere non-uniformity that was addressed on descending limb.
So I think you could probably come up with sarcomer lengths, on the ascending limb. I believe Dave Morgan also argued that it worked there too, where you come up with greater non-uniformities, and then actually things become stronger as you get with the stretch, so you could produce more force by almost reducing the non-uniformities. But if you didn't look at the sarcomer lengths, then you can't address that.
Would be very easy. I assume though to go back and, you know, in the first steady state isometric, and then in the last one when you reach steady state, just take a single frame out at steady state before you stretch and a single frame after you stretch, and just measure all the sarcomere lengths and see what the sarcomere length is and what the distribution is. And just see if it's greater, smaller, or about the same. We tend to find in skeletal muscle that it's about the same, but it might actually be interesting for cardiac as well. And would be relatively quick because you have a very small number of, I think I have 8
to
we
12.
have 20 so far, so you have 20 which is before, 20 after. Regime has a nice program that spits the results out for you instantaneously, so I think it's follow up just to be on the safe side.
Any other questions?
Yeah. So let's assume that some of your myofibrils actually didn't have the N to A region, and therefore, and still your mechanism is right and Titin binds. Then what would you speculate might bind if it's not N to A?
So if if the myofibril doesn't show N to A region at all, having only N to B region, then my answer regarding the interaction between actin and titin would be, well, my first answer should be, I still don't know where specifically it would contribute to the interaction with the actin filament, but that area should be found in both skeletal and cardiac myofibril. So that's what I speculate for now.
And I don't think anybody has ever done in vitro motility assays to test specific for N2A or other areas, but people have done it for PDK.
Right.
And PDK seems to slow down motility in actin, and actin PDK interactions have been shown in vitro to occur spontaneously. So for me at least, the more normal candidate would always have been the PDK area, because at least there is some in vitro evidence that actin and PDK do interact, whereas although one group is very adamant and very loud about N2A, but there's really not even in vitro motility assay or other in vitro information that they do find. That's something to think about. The other thing is, at the beginning, you mentioned Daniel Han's paper on multi-joint force enhancement. Explain to me quickly how that works.
That's just completely, I forgot about that.
Did you read the paper at all?
Oh, I did, but that's a month ago.
Because I always thought it was very difficult, because in a multi-joint movement, you do a maximum contraction, but clearly some of your muscles would not be at maximum at all. Maybe one joint, maybe in an extensor action, maybe the knee joint would be fully kind of extending, but maybe the hip, the ankle would not. And I'm always a bit hesitant about the multi-joint movement, how much you can actually control that. And clearly there would be many muscles there, many leg extensor muscles in a leg extension exercise that would not be fully activated. So I never really fully understood how that actually works. But I just wanted to see if you have an opinion on that. It's okay. I just thought, see if you have the reference there.
Yeah, I mean, I read it, but really didn't pay attention to how specifically they do.
I find it very, very, very tricky to define it on that level.
Yes, thanks, Seong-won again.